Won't you lend your lungs to me? Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
Good morning, James.
Good morning, Lynn.
Welcome to episode 25 of the Crackpot Podcast with LaFond and Lockhart. It's February 5th. Yesterday was the Super Bowl and the Eagles prevailed, and Philadelphia is a smoking ruin this morning. Well, today's topic, James, was suggested by the Twitter world, which includes today John Paul Barber and J5 Killer or Cinco Jotas. I don't know what he really likes to be called. But J5 is a fellow that was interviewed by Kevin Michael Grace, I think last year, and you listened to his interview, so I know you're a little bit familiar with him.
Yes.
And he posts on NPC, which is a forum, which is actually where I found my first link to your website. So that's nice. He is a Trump supporter. But before we get into Trump, I want to open with a topic of something that we have just touched on previously, which is the spiritual aspect of monarchy. There's a monarchist thread in the alt-right, and we talked about the warrior king, and we promised to talk about the spiritual aspects of monarchy also.
Yeah, I've been kind of avoiding it because it'll probably take me an hour to go over that subject. But now, since I'm 25 years old in podcast years, maybe I'm mature enough to handle it. So I've got a lot more to offer about the ideas and the history and prehistory of it than about Trump himself. I would have to leave people that actually care about politics to figure out where he fits in.
Well, we want your historical parallels to the current age.
I'll see how there are a lot of monarchs that have, lived in various wise in the junkyard of my mind. Also, American pseudo-monarchs, too, from the plantation era that I call it, a little bit later. So, yeah, there's a lot to go over. I would say that this is essentially what the Epic of Gilgamesh is about. I wrote it, and I did all the annotations to it, and my adaptation, and which is just the Epic of Gilgamesh with my footnotes. And Gilgamesh, this is like, that gives you a picture of a society that's just out of tribalism. And they're trying to get back to the sense of decency they had before. The three aspects that you see in the executive branch were generally not considered to be one in the executive branch or what preceded it in tribal society. So you have what's good, the goodness, that's usually represented as whatever the elder council is. There's the power, the prowess, that's represented by the war chief and his influence and leadership over the energies of the military age male population. And then there's the visionary aspect, which for us, from a religious point of view, the goodness and the visionary, that's all combined, for instance, in Christianity into one thing. But in a more primitive society, the visionary aspect is separated out. So you would have three aspects. You would have the war chief, who was temporary. He had to meet the standards of goodness of the elders, and he pretty much operated as their agent in the field. And then any of these guys that are successful, they were said to have had a visionary person that they consulted. So the legend of Arthur and Merlin would be most apropos to this. Even Attila the Hun supposedly had a shamanic figure, maybe a female, that advised him and treated him to visions. What you have at the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the people are screaming out in such agony under his rule that it's it's interrupting the gods' serenity in heaven. The gods are so bothered by the shrill screaming from earth that they decide to make a more primitive version of Gilgamesh to challenge him, who's Enkidu. He really represents the more ancient, primal, tribal, shamanic aspects of leadership. And him and Gilgamesh end up becoming closer than brothers. They end up becoming as close as two men can be. Then when Gilgamesh is punished by the gods by them having Enkidu killed after they go out together and they desecrate the forest, then he finds himself really conflicted internally, and he's trying to find the Enkidu in him. So he goes on this vision quest while he's it's actually his phase of mourning for his wilder half who's been killed by the gods. And there's a specific point in the epic where the elders plead for him not to risk himself in a quest because they're impotent without him. So what I see in Republican forms of government and in a debased faction, ended in a debased fashion when it comes to the democratic versions of Republican government, is our attempt to reconstruct the elders, the war chief, and the shaman into three aspects of government. But it doesn't. It never really works exactly that way. The visionary aspect is never really addressed in the forms of government that comes from elsewhere. So you end up with this fourth estate, essentially, which is, that position gets co-opted by academia and the press, and it continues to get corrupted and ground down first into ethics and then just into practicality. So that's probably the best example from America of the aspects of power and spirituality working together. Is not in one person, it's in two. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull represented visionary and goodness, so he's got two aspects there. And Crazy Horse represents the power. He's the direct actionist. In an earlier period, you had Tecumseh and his brother. His brother was the visionary, but didn't represent goodness. Tecumseh represented the power and the goodness together. So you had these two unequal parts, but in that case, that fell apart. It worked better for the Sioux later on because you had the visionary and the goodness aspect combined, whereas with Tecumseh, you had the goodness and the power aspect combined, and the visionary guy was just a kook that caused a lot of trouble. He became unrooted from the baseline of their society, the framework that had been laid down by their elders, and had gotten them to where they were. So those are just some kind of prehistoric. We can essentially use American Indians as examples of what prehistoric life might have looked like, because our ancestors that came here were in close contact with them as they slowly came out of the Stone Age. So you got to see those forms of government. In fact, Benjamin Franklin suggests in some of his papers that the Constitution of the United States, or at least the Articles of Confederation, was based on the Iroquois Confederation, the Five Fire Council. And he said at this time it was Six Nations because the Tuscaroras had joined them. And he said in so many words, if these six savage nations can form a confederacy, we can form a confederacy. So the Republican government has tribal aspects all through it, and most of us don't realize that. Okay, I think I kind of spat that out as coherently as I can.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the aspects are there just really close to the surface. I think the fact that we have these dynastic families like the Bushes, the Clintons, the Kennedys, as we saw that young man who I guess is a senator, Joe Kennedy III. He was called on to give a speech, and these are families that are just have really nothing to recommend them, yet we cling to them. And I think it just shows that there's that monarchical kind of need.
They play on our sentimental attachment to the idea of cultural continuity. And when you take away cultural continuity, and this is part of the way that you rule in a modern sense, then you can replace it by your counterfeit bloodline, by your non-heroic parade of parasites and leeches with under the same name. I see that as basically a hijacking of what people want to see in monarchy. On one aspect, the bloodline aspect of monarchy, people want to see continuity. But the other aspect of monarchy that people want to see is rescue from the oligarchy. Oligarchies always run nations and governments in ancient and modern settings. There was a break from it for a while in the medieval world, and for the most part, primitive societies avoid this. But you could see the first example of the oligarchy trying to feed into this, trying to set up a front man to steal the sentiment from the hearts of the regular people and put them back into power, was Bacon's Rebellion. The more I research this, the more I find out that this poor 26-year-old guy, Nathaniel Bacon, he was a puppet. He was a patsy and a scapegoat for one faction of the oligarchs that were going to war against the other faction of the oligarchs, who had the governor on their side. And he was just good at swearing and cussing, and he could fight a little bit. That was it. He was outdone by a 75-year-old man. He actually lost to a very senior man when he was in his late 20s. The second example of that in American history is George Washington. George Washington wasn't a good general. He was a confidence man. He was put forward by his backers and was propagandized. He was credited with victories won by his juniors, by his junior commanders and men in other theaters. The major victories were not won with him on the scene. He wasn't even around there. He was a figurehead that everybody made sure they imbued him with confidence. Everybody wanted to look up to this guy, and he turned out to be a very good actor. He was a lot more like Bill Clinton, and he was like a cross between Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan. Okay. And he was nothing like the stronger American presidents. And one of the main reasons to put him up there was because he looked like a kingly character. He had an aristocratic bearing. He would beat his own men. For instance, he carried a baton. He would beat his own slaves, white and black. He didn't even need an overseer to do it. And he was a great liar. He was a murderer. He had no honor. He actually permitted an Indian guide of his to murder a French officer who he held captive. And then when he promised to stand trial for this in the French military court, when he was captured by the brother of this French officer, he then reneged on that and went back against it. So anyways, he's a scumbag, good actor, big imposing guy. The reason why he was really chosen for his position was so that the common people would, and the soldiers would suggest and offer to him the kingship of the United States, because they wanted a king, because their beef wasn't with the King of England, it was with the English mercantile system, and they now found themselves in the hands of all the rich bastards that were exploiting them to begin with. He turned it down, and it's seen as this great thing in our mythology, but what he did was he maintained his devil's pact with the oligarchy, and he sold the American people down the river. And then immediately after that, you have 20,000 Americans who just got out of servitude basically flee to the West. They'd rather get murdered by Shawnees on the Ohio River than continue to live under these rich bastards. In Bacon and Washington, you see the supposed war chief. You see the figure that conjures up the image of the war chief in our subconscious that's going to rescue us from the conniving sorts of people. And in both cases, they're just puppets. They're not real. And we can go over some kings who were really that type of guy, and we can go over some of the more spiritual kings too. But that's kind of my take on the early American expressions of this.
Yeah, I think that we have a huge mythology. This is not a surprise to anyone, right? But our founders and even the founding document is supposed to be so very special. And I always think that if aliens, and you're an expert on this, right? If aliens came down,
well, I am an alien, so.
and had to describe the American system of governance, nothing even remotely resembling the Constitution would be included in that description, right? It's such a joke. And we have people who go to law school and work really hard to maintain this mythology that we have a really fantastic founding document and our founding fathers were really smart guys. And certainly some of them were. And that's one thing that you notice is that Washington wasn't really drafting any of this stuff, right? He
did lock him in a room and tell him, you guys aren't coming out until he had something on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there were some things to commend the guy.
Yeah, that's leadership right there, get to work, guys.
If he had you in his power, he was an effective leader.
Yeah.
He wasn't effective at taking power away from other military leaders, but he was jealous enough of his own power and intelligent enough to avoid main battle with better commanders and better armies, and he did his job. He lasted till the end of the war while younger, more competent war leaders beat the shit out of the British and bloodied their nose. And the important thing is he was there to turn down the crown.
Right.
That's our founding myth.
That is our founding myth. And you know what? I know that Washington was awful, and a lot of those guys were also pretty bad in their own different ways. But I don't really care because, on a personal level, I'm an American. There's no country that you can point to that was founded by a saint. There's no government that's populated by saints or good people. You admire these tribal chiefs, but
they only have temporary power.
Yeah,
they only
we don't
have temporary power.
We don't have tribes, and plus those tribal chiefs were nasty in their own way.
When we're on the foundation of this country, I understand I have a bunch of white nationalist readers, maybe some of them are listeners too, that believe this country was founded by white people for white people, and it was not. Okay, it was really founded by a tiny elite of rich, pale people, Christian and otherwise, on the backs of millions of white child slaves who were worked, tortured, raped, and beaten to death and executed. And if you want any proof of this, you could look at, I guess if we could resurrect George Washington's dentist and speak to him about the fact that George Washington did not even have Caucasian teeth in his mouth. In fact, he paid his black slaves to give up their teeth every time he lost a tooth out of his primitive dentures. He did not have wooden teeth. Wooden teeth would not work. They would just turn to mush. Okay, he had Negro teeth in his mouth. Okay, so you white nationalists, you might want to edit your conception of Washington. And also, Washington was in the process of freeing his black slaves and replacing them with Rhinelanders. Why? Because the black slaves, he had to give them up after 6 months in Philadelphia where he did his business, but a white man could be held for 31 years in the state of Pennsylvania. Okay, so rethink about this being founded as a white country for white people. It wasn't. It was a place to make money.
It's an economic zone. I don't disagree with that. And I think that that's remained true. But I think that this country had a golden age, the post-war era, that really was for the little guy. The average guy did really well. There was low crime, there was prosperity. So I think that people look back to that and say, well, why can't we still have that? We can be materialistic type of society and still have low crime and still have...
There's a way we could have it again.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, you could stop immigration, then win a world war without getting nuked.
Yeah.
And then you could live off of that bone pile for a generation, like our grandparents did.
Yeah.
We lived off the bone pile of an annihilated European economy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we didn't, for the 20-year period after World War II, we didn't have significant immigration, particularly not in areas where our job market was strong. We weren't bringing in mechanics and construction workers from other countries like you're bringing in service personnel and IT personnel from other countries now. But that just takes us back to the more ancient way. America was founded really on the process of the managerial class continually replacing one group of immigrants.
Labor
and of course,
pool.
Of course, these immigrants were all pretty much involuntary, but they would replace them with the next group. Yeah, so that you're just seeing right now America going back to what it was when it was founded.
Yeah.
It finally got back on track from the point of view of the ruling class.
Yeah.
Because you think about the disaster that the Jacksonian administration was to the bankers that really founded this country. Okay.
Right.
And they did. They backed they owned the slave ships. They backed it. They're the ones that shipped all of these orphans out of London to die in Virginia, and they paid off the king by giving him a fifth. The British monarchical system is interesting because the king was as much a victim as the mercantile system as his colonial subjects were. And he had a very hard time being able to get his paws onto enough of it to be able to pay for his own officials and not be a total servant to Parliament and to the financial sector. So that's kind of obvious. During Bacon's rebellion, there was no rebellion against the king. The rebels were continually invoking the king, warning the king that they were sending letters to the king, telling him what the governor and the elite were doing to them. So there was not this system of this being a place where a king exploited anybody. That's the mythology that's been fed to us. Charles II was horrified. Now, this was the son of Charles I, who was decapitated at the order of Cromwell. And Virginia stayed loyal to him, even during the Protectorate. There was even talk of Charles hiding out in Virginia, but I think he went to France or Holland or something instead. Now, when he found out that the governor had executed 24 men after the rebellion was over, and largely for vengeance, he was horrified, and he said, paraphrasing him, but this is almost a direct quote, "Why, that old man has hung more people in that naked land than I did for the death of my father." Okay, so that's it. Charles II wasn't some fantastic, beacon of goodness, but he had a real sense of responsibility for his subjects, even the lowest of them.
Okay, this is something that I want to talk about because the democracy and a Republican form of democracy is predicated on this idea of the consent of the governed, the will of the people, right? So how much for an ancient king? Now you went over your three aspects of this ancient form of government: the goodness, the power, the war chief, right, and then the visionary aspect. But how much of any of those three, or all three, derives from the will of the people, or what we say, the consent of the governed?
Okay, the will of the people is a pretty modern concept because most people through most of history were slaves. We don't identify with them, and we don't realize that we're slaves like they were. We live in this fantasy land. They weren't direct actionists, okay, so they weren't considering as having such a will, but they were thought of as human and as having been placed under the king by the higher powers. If we could just go through history from earlier periods up with some examples of kings, that would be helpful, without naming a name, because I only really know the history of about 3 of the pharaohs. The pharaoh was the intercessor. He was the one that interceded with the supernatural aspects. He was supposed to acquire his own visions, but there's a problem with all these early priest-king societies, which we saw in Gilgamesh, where the idea of goodness, vision, and power all going into the same person can cause the aspects to corrupt one another. So, that's why in various points in history, people tried to resurrect the older order where there was a separation of powers. The danger is that you end up with somebody like Shaka Zulu, who's potent, who's a visionary, and who is therefore able to redefine what is good and force it on people. Eventually he was killed by his own. If we can take one ancient example, Philip of Macedonia, he got 3 different ethnic groups together, was able to form an effective army that did not have its equal in the ancient world out of these 3 different ethnic groups, and they were able to throw off the yoke of their Persian masters and actually achieve domination over the Greeks south of them who they always wanted to consider themselves part of Greece, but the Greece always sneered upon them. They were like the Virginians. They were like the West Virginians to the Virginians. Okay, so it would be as if the Hatfields and the McCoys revolted and they took over the rest of Virginia. Okay, and then you have a situation where Philip is the visionary, and he's the potent power, and this in of itself is seen as good. Then his son takes that and becomes a monster. Basically uses the army as a way to achieve godhood, conducts numerous genocides, over a dozen by one count, and is even forcing his men to marry women of ethnicities who they don't want to be married to in order to form this first, multinational, non-national. Right. I mean, the liberals would have actually loved him. He was the most prolific killer of the ancient world, and he was heroic. Him and his father were both hero kings, but you have to say Alexander was more of a Shaka Zulu. Okay, he had no sense of being bound by the original norms of his elders, of their society. Philip still had that. Philip would still accept the counsel of his elder generals, and they represented the social norms. So Alexander has broken totally. He's still a hero, but he's broken totally out of the war chief function. And, he's the god tyrant. He's Shaka Zulu, and he's rampaging across the world. In the period before them, you had Pericles was an example of a municipal manager who had alternating success and disasters as he tried to run the democracy of Athens, because as a democracy it was doomed. I think he fell victim to the plague that eventually ravaged the city. Athens never had a chance because it was a democracy, and to the extent we believe if this country isn't a democracy, we're going to repeat the same thing. He would be recalled occasionally after he was exiled to straighten things out again, because the democracy just doesn't work. And the only way it has any long-term sustainability is when the oligarchs gain control of it. And even then, lots of times they're disasters. Another figure and so this brings them, this power of the people thing brings them into conflict with Sparta, which is a disaster. The Spartans actually preserved the old tribal method. Okay, they had more than one king. Leonidas, the guy that died at Thermopylae, and really kind of forced the Greeks to take a single cause. He even brought Thebans there who were allied to the Persians, and he made them fight with him and die with him. Okay, against their masters. He was a hardcore guy, but he was also doing this in something of a revolt against the ephors, which were the elders, and they were the guardians of the social norms. He thought they had gotten excessively insular, and there needed to be a proactive defense against the Persians to preserve themselves. So Philip would be an example of a hero king that achieves something because he temporarily defies the people that are in charge of deciding what is good, but he does it for the good of the society, and he does it according to their ancient ideal of good. He wasn't playing a game like they were. Okay, he was not a manipulator; he was an actionist. So, and again, that eventually set Sparta on its road to domination of the Hellenic world, which again led to them having this weird empire that fell in disaster because they just fell prey to the temptation of going out and building an empire, and they weren't set up for that. Their government was really a defensive kind of government. Julius Caesar would be an example of somebody that was embraced by the lower classes because he could read them very well, and some people might want to compare Trump to him. And in his death,
you think that's valid?
Only in the broadest sense, in which Trump's a self-made man and Caesar was a self-made man, and they both did things under the auspices of the government that they ended up heading. But Caesar was essentially killed. It would have been like if Trump got killed on election night. Caesar's killed his bid for power, and then that results in a civil war, which does result in a unification of their nation, but in a new form under an autarky, under Octavian or Caesar Augustus. For instance, Caesar wasn't the hero king. He had Mark Antony. Mark Antony and other direct actionists were the guys that made him look like a hero.
But he did have the support of the people, right?
Yeah. He managed to support the lower classes against the upper classes. And why not? They were rotten. Of course, he was rotten himself. And this is why I wouldn't compare him too directly to Trump. Okay, it would be as if instead of Trump making his money as he did, imagine if Trump made his money by exterminating the population of China and selling the people he didn't kill into slavery. Imagine if he made his money that way. That would be Caesar. Okay,
yeah,
that's a whole different thing because he's an evil dude. Trump is somebody that seems to come more out of the ethos of his society than Caesar did. Caesar went way beyond everything. Trump's like Mr. Awesome that goes to the top of the setting he was born into, but doesn't seem to try to break it up and form something else.
Well, yeah, okay. I don't know. His father was in the real estate business, but his father stayed in Queens, and Trump always wanted to go to Manhattan, and he did. But it's just a real estate business, right? He's not conquering foreign tribes or whatever. But the parallel, and you mentioned the assassination, obviously, of Caesar, and I believe that you anticipated, and maybe you still anticipate, an assassination attempt on Trump.
Yes, and yes.
Well, what has been revealed in the last week or so or more is that the FBI, maybe other parts of the government, the surveillance apparatus, was mobilized against the Trump presidential campaign.
They decided on character assassination instead of physical
assassination, and also presumably feeding whatever information back to the Clinton campaign, right? I don't know what kind of secrets are traded inside of a campaign, but whatever their strategy was would presumably be fed back to the Clinton campaign. So anyway, they mobilized a large resources against him. I always say that whatever power a person or an organization has, they will ultimately use it for whatever ends that they want. That's sort of like a rule that I believe in.
I think it's a good rule.
And this is a topic you covered too, like they're working on self-driving cars, and I believe that be a day when somebody is assassinated by their self-driving car because
yeah,
it's easy
that's
to
gonna
do,
happen.
right? Yeah, because it'll be really easy to do, and it might not come from on high. It might just be a proactive employee at a lower level will say, hey, this person is not very nice, and I'm going to drop their collision priority down, so they'll be the car that gets squashed.
There was an FBI whistleblower whose car went haywire on him a couple of years ago. He died, and then there was also the couple who both claimed that they saw a second shooter at the Las Vegas shooting who died in a mysterious car fire right in front of their house.
Well, Teslas Teslas already have a lot of remote capabilities. Like the Tesla headquarters can send instructions to all the Tesla cars. I don't know exactly how they do it, if it's Wi-Fi or if it's cell signal, or probably cell signal. It's there, and maybe it already has been used. But my rule of thumb is that if they can do it, they will do it. So this is what happened inside the government. The liberal control of the bureaucracy at every level, seems like, just took the initiative to use their power against the Trump campaign. And Trump prevailed. I think his support is much broader and deeper than any polls can reveal, and that any pundit or any person could say right now. I think that if he were to be assassinated, we would be like when Caesar was assassinated. We would be in a civil war scenario.
Yes, and in that way, that could be a very valid comparison to him between the two. And of course, that's the way the Romans made their money. The Romans made their bones by going out and slaughtering other nations and tribes. Right. That's not how we do it now. Our guys, our leading men, make their money otherwise. I can tell you that the more that the press attacks this guy, the more I notice that pretty apolitical people in my family seem to like him and seem to be more against immigration. It seems like the press is almost engineering a civil war here. Maybe they figure they're going to have all the law enforcement agencies on their side, and that'll make them okay. I don't know what they're thinking, but it's obviously,
I don't think they're thinking clearly at all. You know,
it's just an effect that I've noticed. I mean, people in my family that generally aren't even interested in these things are now bringing them up, and I'm seeing them go from like these in Maryland. Basically, you have your Republicans are like Democrats in other places, and your Democrats are SJWs.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm in California, so it's the same.
Okay, so
there aren't even Republicans.
Yeah, so my Republican family members are now starting to act like they live in Wyoming or something, Right. And this seems to be in response to what they're being exposed to in the media. So I think you have the makings of civil unrest. Well, we already have civil unrest, and they're even calling it that. I mean, you've actually got an undeclared race war on the ground. For instance, where I am, I mean, there's a lot of ways that we parallel with the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, but I don't think any of them are parallel enough to use one to read the other one, step for step.
I think that we have to be careful about making predictions. I'm not going to make any predictions, really, but it's tempting to make predictions, but you're right that the parallels are not perfect, and we never know what will happen anyway. I think that there's something different in terms of the legitimacy of his presidency, if it has parallels to a monarchy, in your view, and even the aspect of war, of a war chief, because this is actually something that is out there in the ideas in the alt-right. So I'll read this quote from J5.
Okay.
And this is in a long string of tweets, so I'm picking number 18 here. He says, but you need to know that Trump is not the end of the conflict, he's the beginning. He's our war chief, not the Messiah. He leads us, he doesn't save us. We have to follow and we have to fight, and it's going to be a long, long war. These ideas are out there. I just want you to know, I mean, that the idea of a war chief, of a fight is out there. It's not a physical battle.
Well, he's the direct actionist, and that's what the war chief was in their setting at that technology level, and Trump is the direct actionist in our much different setting. He's actually willing to go out there and act and do things and
right.
Say things that he's not supposed to be able to say. And it is true that he represents power of action, which is what, on a basic level, that's what the war chief represents, the power
right.
of action. Our goodness, our regard for our elders and trying to maintain social norms and everything, that's not even there. That's something that our society doesn't even possess. It's been completely destroyed. Yeah. And that's what makes it difficult for somebody like Trump that's an actionist. That's why it makes them difficult and treacherous for them at every step, because there's not just this rock of opinion that this is good and
right.
this is bad that he can step back on. No. What is good and bad is actually up for debate every step of the way now.
Yeah, it's up for debate, and those who hold the microphone in the debate are the academia and the press that will tell you the opposite of Trump is what's good.
So there you see, you have the destruction of the good. That's right. Not there. Okay, it's up for debate. You have the part taken by the shaman or the poet, okay, or the wise man, the wizard, Sitting Bull, for instance. That part has been assumed by academia and the media, which are totally corrupt, and they just serve this material order.
Yeah.
Okay, and the president, as we've seen, all these presidents were puppets.
Yeah.
The last president that wasn't a puppet was probably Teddy Roosevelt. What you have now is you had one aspect of the order is dead, the other aspect is corrupt, and the central aspect, the power, that's nothing but a puppet operated by the people behind the scenes. And he's basically the puppet that's cut his own strings. Yeah. They still got a couple attached to him, and he's trying to cut them too. And So this is just very interesting.
It's interesting, and I think on a social level, and even as you say, the arbiter of what is good and what isn't, he's kind of revealed that you don't have to listen to these people. As you see in your family, you have people expressing opinions that 2 years ago were unthinkable.
Right, and his game is to let people believe that generally what they think is good is good.
Right. To believe their own eyes, in a way.
Right. So you don't have to buy into that new construction. There are some, if you want to go over them, there are some examples that people use for different hero kings who have had positive effects according to our view that we can look at if you wish.
Yeah.
You mentioned 2 of them.
Yep.
In your email right before
I
that.
credit those back to J5. He's the
okay.
one that, he's the one that drew the parallels to those guys. Oh, here's another one, King David. Here to give you. I was going
to use him actually.
Oh, okay. Well, see,
yeah.
There's the thread here. Go on. So you go on.
I'll leave David alone, okay? But as far as Constantine and Charlemagne, they were unifiers. Constantine more than Charlemagne. Charlemagne was more expansionist than he was a unifier. The real unifier behind Charlemagne was his grandfather, Charles Martel. He's the guy that saved the country from the Muslim invasion.
Yeah.
His grandson assumed his mantle, did some really crappy things. I mean, like when you talk about unification with Charlemagne and Christianity, Christianity in Europe was never a grassroots thing. It didn't come up to the leadership. It was something that was imposed on the population by the elite. It was this outside thing. Charlemagne imposed Christianity on people that were not and executed thousands and thousands of people who didn't want to be Christians. He was imitating Constantine. Now, Constantine didn't run these programs that Charlemagne did because he got onto the tide of Christianity when it was rising after it had come up. Previous to Constantine, Christianity had been something that was grassroots. He was looking for something that would help unify his soldiery, his soldiers, and he latched on to Christianity. Even at the same time, his men were also adhering to beliefs that were quite pagan, and he still had a lot of pagan aspects to his rule. For instance, he liked boxing matches, and that was considered a pagan activity. Charlemagne's really imitating that. One really cruddy thing he did is after he defeated the Lombards, he disenfranchised them. The Lombards were never again to be warriors. They couldn't be warriors because they were tough to beat. So the only thing they were able to do was to be itinerant bankers, to travel around and loan money. And this is where in the Magna Carta, when you see that that debt is more important than family, that the first thing that you have to consider is paying off the debtors of somebody, or is paying off the creditors for somebody that dies in debt. And they say Jews and others. That meant Templars and Lombards also. He was actually responsible for this class of rootless people that had a corrosive effect on the economy and everything. What he made didn't turn into some kind of monster empire, because there were a lot of barbarian invasions that nipped away at it. The Magyars and the Vikings, for instance, started getting up ahead of steam right as he was expanding his empire to its greatest extent. So eventually he did lend stability to that portion of Europe, to Western Europe, for a decent amount of time, not because he was heroic. For instance, Roland was a hero. Roland was actually betrayed by Charlemagne because Charlemagne had gotten old and tired, and he just wanted to get along with the Muslims. Now, these are the people that tried to conquer his grandfather's country, and he cut a deal with them, and he stopped fighting them. And Roland stayed behind and guarded Charlemagne's rear to keep Charlemagne's army from getting wiped out, even though Charlemagne trusted the Muslims. Roland didn't, and he died a hero defending this pass against the Muslim enemy. So you do a hero king, a unifier, would be more like Charles Martel, which again makes sense. It's more of a Trump analogy than Charlemagne, because Trump didn't inherit a political legacy like Charlemagne did. He was a self-made man that came up in the system. He wasn't the guy running the whole country. He wasn't the king when he stopped the Muslim invasion. He was something of a steward. Forget what his exact title was. Probably the two best examples, I think, of hero kings in Europe, and then we can do two in America later, but one's first would be Alfred the Great, who's just 100 years after Charlemagne, not even that much longer after Charlemagne. He's the guy that stopped the Danes from taking any more of Anglo-Saxon England, and he actually was the first to declare himself king of the Anglo-Saxons. He inherited his position, but he wasn't the oldest son. He wasn't thought to be the person that was going to take it. And he was a man that went out and fought battles, and he won. And he also spent just as much time trying to unify his people under him. He spent no time really trying to expand his holding. He managed a stalemate against an enemy that was trying to enslave his people. Probably a guy that, and by the way, he tried to resurrect wrestling and boxing too, because he read the classics. He was really an intellectual. Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, and the High King really didn't have much power. He was the guy that everybody trusted to lead the Confederated Army when there was a outside enemy that had to be fought. So, the Irish are essentially still tribal people at this time, and you get to see kind of how a war chief behaves, and they defeat the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf, and Brian Boru dies in this battle, and he was also fighting against Irish traitors too, and he even had people trying to turn on him in his own ranks, but still they won. Okay, and so he's one of the most beloved figures in Irish history. That's a real hero king. So that's Trump if he gets assassinated. If you want to find a historical parallel there, that would be it. Probably Brian Boru. Because also, if you look at the party that Trump is in charge of, a lot of those guys hate him. They ran against him. Yeah. They tried to subvert him. Brian Boru had the same problem, and eventually he's victorious, but he pays with his life in the process. Hopefully that's not the case here. But in our society, if Trump pays by losing his business and his reputations, for instance, what if he doesn't win a second term? Okay. Right. Or what if he succeeded after his second term by a really rabid leftist government? Then his businesses will probably be wiped out, and he'll spend the rest of his life on trial for various crimes against humanity, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So there's a way where you could be effectively killed without being killed in our current setting.
Oh, yeah.
Information society. So that remains to be seen if he ends up having the same effect as Brian Boru, and he won hundreds of years of freedom for his nation.
Yeah, it's a constant battle. I think people are kind of waking up to that fact that you don't just you get your guy in and then relax, because the opposition will always continue. So, and that brings me to the next thing I want to ask you that we kind of touched on earlier, is this question of the oligarchs, that the oligarchs can persecute the king just as much as they persecute the people. I think I think we see that, and I'm biased because I'm here in the Silicon Valley area, so I'm biased towards these technology companies, but I see these technology companies as absolutely doing a huge amount of work against Trump and against... So is there any hope against the oligarchs? Do we have any historical parallels to see where the oligarchs' power declined?
You have a natural alliance. Well, again, Caesar was one, but he was as bad as any of the oligarchs he was going against. In a way, he maybe used the people against his own class. So I don't see him as a real good example. Philip of Macedon really was not a bad example. He's overshadowed by his son. The idea is that the way that the oligarchs are going to stay in power is to continue to cloud the fact that the natural alliance against them is the head of state and the people. That's the natural alliance, is the head of state and the people. He's supposed to be their savior. That's why the Magna Carta was so damaging and cursed us to this. And we're taught that it's the opposite. We're taught that it was the people putting it to the king and putting the reins on him. But no, it was not. It was the oligarchs. The only people mentioned in that okay, were the political movers and shakers. Nobody else had a place in that document. And the first thing they did was sideline God. They made God subject to man. Okay, that takes away the idea in the Christian experience, the idea that the king is divinely ordained. That means he represents the good and he represents the vision. It's trying to put it all with him as a counterbalance to the oligarchs, that are people that are just dealing in slaves and merchandise. The people and merchandise to them are the same thing. And these people will rise up in any civilization because civilization is based on accumulation of surpluses. So it's one of the things that I think you have to give the Catholic Church credit for is establishing the king as their man. Okay, he's the church's man. And you could see the church, one, gets largely cut out of the Magna Carta, and they're also shown as supporting it. Well, you got to imagine that, a little brother of the cardinal that was there was probably getting his thumbnails taken out when this was going on. There was some kind of pressure that was applied to the church to go along with the Magna Carta that I'm sure was not savory pressure. It's hard. This is a hard thing to do when you don't have an ethnic or tribal identity. The two guys that I would want to use for examples of Americans that did this are people that there was King Philip of the Wampanoags, the people of the East. He tried to defend his people and preserve his people by fighting against the traitor Indian tribes and the English. And he was outnumbered at least 10-1. He was outnumbered by the traitor Indians. So this is something to think of. If we're thinking of the traitors in our country bringing in people that speak other languages and have other value systems and using them to outvote us and having them live off of taxes that are placed on us, then our counterpart in American history is this Indian chief who gets together a small alliance of the most beleaguered tribes, the tribes that aren't in favor with the internationalists, okay, and who are also shipping in drugs and getting the English are pumping the young Indian men full of liquor. Okay, they're dealing drugs just like the CIA is dealing drugs to our young men. He does fight. He does not succeed, but he almost succeeds. Even though the odds were vastly against him, he was facing odds that are far worse than the odds that we're facing now. For instance, one of the Indian tribes that was allied with the English could have defeated him on their own. Okay, that's how bad it was. This guy essentially didn't have a chance, but him and his people managed to wipe out 80 settlements and killed 9,000 English people who were the invaders, who were the immigrants who spoke a different language and were trying to gate his culture. So there's your counterpart right there. The other guy is Tecumseh. William Tecumseh Sherman. His parents named him after this guy. This guy, like King Philip, was actually loved by a lot of white people. Look back on him, and they saw him as more of an example of how they should live as Americans than the so-called Puritans that did him wrong. Right. Because a lot of these people from New England had actually gained power in the colonies, and they were doing a lot of abusive things. So there's some cause for it there. Tecumseh actually tried to form a pan-Indian alliance. He spent years traveling all around North America, getting tribes to ally against the United States government. And he did it in alliance with the British, who promised to back him. And he was killed when the British pulled their army out at the last moment and left him to fight the Americans by himself. He was, again, a guy that immediately the people that killed him thought that he was better than they were. The guy, this was kind of like the Romans writing about Hannibal. Yeah, he was a better man than we were. It was the same thing. It was something they wanted to do. They wanted his tribal land. They wanted to be able to make a lot of money. So they needed to kill this guy. But as soon as they killed him, they're like, wow, he was like the best thing in our life, So it's a shame. It's a shame he's dead. So these are men. And by the way, Tecumseh was probably half white. He was he imitated white children when he was a child. to set up ambushes for his older brother's war party. So, white people back then would look at him when he didn't have his war paint on and say, "Oh, there's a little white kid. Let's go save him." So, so he's a mixed race dude, and his main general, the guy that preceded him, Blue Jacket, was 100% white. So the problem is these people saw it too late. When you look at when these guys saw that there was a problem and tried to get their people together, it was too late. It was too far gone. They were a vast minority. Trump is essentially doing the same thing as King Philip and Tecumseh did, but he's doing it when his ethnic group still has a supermajority. However, half of his ethnic group are people who hate who hate themselves, who hate their ethnic group, who want to commit suicide, they want to commit demographic suicide. They want to not have kids, and they want to adopt kids from other nations who hate this nation. So he's got a much better chance of kicking off something that's going to work out than those guys did. That was like the final effort for their people when they did those acts. So he's in a better position, like Brian Boru was in Ireland. Most of Ireland was still Irish, and all they had to do was go to the East Coast and kick the shit out of the Norse and some of their allies from other parts of the British Isles. So if you look at the map of America, the political map, where you see where the red and blue is, you got all this blue on the coast and you got all this red in the middle of the country. And so conceptually, it's similar to the situation that Peru had in Ireland.
Yeah, and in terms of geography, it's the vast majority is still held by Trump supporters. Right. I mean, it's not all very easily defended. But.
Which, if you think about it, that puts red political people, the Trump supporters, that puts the flyover people in the same exact position that the American Indians were in.
Yeah.
Where they have the land, but they're not as numerous as the people in the cities who are greedy and the millions of people that are being brought in to help take the rest of their land away. So you really want to look at the history of the Eastern Woodland tribes as a model for what's happening now. Because it's just a repetition of the same process as population replacement.
Yeah, it really is. And it didn't work out so well for the Indians the first time around. So, hopefully people can see that.
Well, you have the people that fled from their servitude on these plantations and went west and founded all these territories that became states and in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. They were also people who were being replaced because you had the plantation owners. First, they replaced the Indians with all these poor white people. Then they replaced the poor white people with black people.
Right.
And black folks.
It's all about labor pools. Yeah.
Right. And black folks might not believe it, but they're being replaced now. They're like the next wave to go.
And white people too. Right. We have not only immigration, but we have offshoring of what you might call middle class jobs.
So it's actually in the economic sphere, it's really continued broadly.
Oh yeah.
Just the offshore.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just the technology, it's also the manufacturing, which would have been really important to a lot of Americans and which has been just removed from the country. And when we were talking about the golden age after World War II, I don't think we have to have a world war. I think we have enough people, enough resources, enough talent, and just so many things going on inside the United States that there's more than enough to create a thriving market, if you worship the economy, as so many people do, that you don't really need to destroy everybody else's industry. You could do enough here.
The problem is when you get unification, you still have these manipulative people working around who are then going to try to direct that to external expansion. That's what happened in the United States. Now, I mean, as soon as all the territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border, as soon as that was locked down, we started war with the Spanish and started conquering stuff around the world. And that's just a danger. I mean, but since you have the opportunity to actually expand into the solar system, it doesn't necessarily mean you got to go after other people. If you could get control of your own country, then you could actually expand economically out into space instead of just fighting over the same turf that's been fought over for the last few thousand years.
Well, I agree with that, and I also think that a new line of thought needs to flourish, which is that endless expansion is not needed. I think the Japanese provide a model here where you don't need expansion. You can just have specialization inside the economy, or you can have stasis is not the end of the world, you know? Nobody is starving in Japan. Their society is in very good shape regardless of the warnings that have gone out for decades about their shrinking population and so on.
Most of your tribal societies traditionally had zero growth populations. Right. You know, when they had to move, it was usually because they got bumped by another group of people.
All right.
You know,
or they ate all the delicious animals that in the area.
This lack of ability to adjust to having surpluses in a decent way, you know, has now become worshipped as this grow or die. Which I don't get a grow or die economy unless you're going to expand beyond this planet, because you've got finite resources here. And the same people who preach grow or die are also the people that are telling you that, you know, it's wanting to go to the moon or to Mars, it's selfish, it won't help anybody here. And
Right.
I think it just comes down to people getting greedy, and the fact that our society worships greed. I think there's a little bit of a problem there. But again, I think that Trump is a good example against the worship of greed, because he's apparently it was just a dominance exercise for him, acquiring money. And then he got bored with that and he moved on to something else. And he's got to be losing money. This dude's had to have lost a lot of money becoming president.
It depends. He hasn't really disclosed what his businesses are worth, but some people who estimate that sort of thing think that it has dropped by, you know, $3 or $4 billion or more.
Yeah, plus he had to spend money. Yeah. He probably spent money helping himself get elected.
He spent money, but not nearly what the opposition spent. Not even close, actually. It was impressive.
Right, so I think he's a good example about how you can just set aside the materialism and the greed. In that sense, you know, there's a visionary aspect to him.
Yeah.
He's not just playing the same game. He broke the rules of the game.
Yeah. It's backwards looking, right? Even the motto, Make America Great Again, it's looking towards the past, and that's not usually what we think of as a visionary. At least not in Western culture. I think in Asian cultures it's much more focused on the past and on the heroes and the greatness and how do we live up to our fathers and stuff like that. But in Western culture, we are more outward focused and expansionary.
Well, that's visionary to me. We're supposed to just worship material progress, and that's it, right? And he's actually saying that there are things that were better before. And that's like blasphemy.
Yeah. You can't, there couldn't possibly have been anything good in the world before 1965. Right? Or 68, whatever, the civil rights movement. Nothing good ever happened to a black person before Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and those guys. It was just pure oppression and pure misery, and we can't look backwards and see anything good.
One aspect of the civil rights thing is black folks no longer reading about people like Booker T. Washington or even Frederick Douglass who pulled themselves up. That's like, there's a very small canon now that you're really allowed to look at. And because I know I had two sons in Baltimore City schools, so every February they get their only history lesson, which is Black history, and they've got to do book reports, and you're only allowed to do book reports on, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. And that's pretty much it. You bounce back and forth between them. You can do Rosa Parks too, but you know, people that are all part of the same period in
Harriet
time.
Tubman.
That's and there's even female figures from that back in the middle of the 1800s that are far more interesting than Harriet Tubman. That you won't see. You will not see these people looked at because they don't fit this narrative since 1965. You know, a lot of that history has just been gutted. It's like it's shoved into uncomfortable corners.
Yeah.
there's a chance, really, for most of the groups in this country to be able to start taking a more in-depth look at their own history, because a lot of everybody's history has just been blotted out by our current climate.
Yeah, you just pick the few threads that support your worldview and then discard the rest.
That's right. Modern civics, okay?
Yeah. I think this has been a good discussion. I think that this is what I was hoping for, and you did a great job, James.
Oh, thanks. I'll try to listen to it. But hopefully I didn't make any mistakes, okay?
Well, we can forgive each other. I'm sure I made plenty. So that was episode 25. Special thanks once again to John Paul Barber and to J5 on Twitter. And I will link you guys when I put this up.
Oh, thank you, Lynn.
Thanks a lot.
We'll meet again under the sun every 12 minutes and another one's gone. This meat's in your makeup, splashes on your lips.